Hi, my name is Carl Binder, and I'm the CEO of the Performance Thinking Network. I'd like to take a few minutes to give you an overview and an introduction to what we call Six Boxes Performance Thinking, which is our approach to organizational performance improvement. I want to talk to you about different applications and users, both on the performance professionals, staff side of the organization, and also managers and leaders, and tell you just a little bit about the programs we have to help implement this. I always like to start out with this statement. It seems rather obvious, but it's always worth stating that our purpose, whether we're leaders and managers or on the staff side in HR or process improvement or training and development or organizational development or quality, and our purpose is to accelerate business results, organizational results through the performance of people. Now, I mention this because it's very easy to forget it. We often get so involved in our programs, our initiatives, our deliverables, our processes that we forget this. But the whole point is connecting the behavior of people, the performance of people to the organization's results. And as you'll see, our models and our approach really builds this in and makes it very explicit. I want to talk a little bit about where this came from. I don't want to spend a lot of time, but each of these three men were my personal mentors, and they were predecessors to this work. Dr. Skinner, with whom I had the good fortune to study while I was a doctoral student at Harvard, introduced to me the idea that if we take a natural science approach to our own behavior, our own performance, that we can systematically improve things like instruction, management, therapy, and so forth. Tom Gilbert, who was a postdoc with Skinner at one point and who was a big influence on me, started out as a program instruction guy, but he's one of the fathers of performance improvement. And as you'll see, at the core of what we do is a focus on what we call accomplishments, which came from Tom Gilbert. And also our model, the Six Boxes model, can be traced back to his work. And finally, Dr. Joe Harless, who himself was a protege of Tom Gilbert's, really helped bring this into practical application in a big way. And I had the good fortune of being mentored by him over a couple of decades. So that's where this stuff is coming from. There's also somebody else, though, and although he didn't know it and I never knew him, Steve Jobs had a big impact on this work, because even as early as the late 70s, when the Apple II came out of his work with Steve Wozniak, what Jobs represented was taking complex, somewhat nerdy technology and putting it into a package in the form of the Apple II originally that a housewife could use to store recipes in her kitchen. And I would say that the work that I've done over the years, while I'm certainly no Steve Jobs, and the work that I've done with my colleagues over really the last 30 years has been an effort to try to take relatively complex performance improvement methodologies and systems and processes and make them simple and accessible to a lot of people. So the focus is on simplicity. Now, in contrast to that, as you may be aware, there are lots of models and methodologies for improving performance. You can go to management consultants and look in Harvard Business Review, or you can go to instructional design or human performance technology or various other fields and methodologies. And you'll see a whole lot of complicated methods. And I have one article from which I pulled a bunch of graphics, which you'll see flashing on the screen here. These models each represent models produced by important thought leaders, applied to performance, and used by some folks and published. But what you'll see by each of them, beside the fact that they're all different, they overlap a lot. There's different, there's the Venn diagram model, and there's ones that look more like process flows, and there's some that look kind of like org charts and cubes. And then, of course, there's the big one, as we might say, which has been posted on the website of the International Society for Performance Improvement for at least a couple decades. And they call this the human performance technology model. And I always call it the everything, including the kitchen sink model, because if you look at it, you realize that there's just about everything you could imagine doing in any effort to improve performance. Now, that's all great, but it doesn't communicate well. And by and large, I find even among our performance consulting colleagues who tend to, like myself, like sort of nerdy, complex stuff, even this is a bit overwhelming to them. And certainly when we present it to our stakeholders, to managers and leaders who just want to see improvements, the questions always come up like, how long is this going to take? And this looks kind of complicated to me. And is this analysis paralysis? So in contrast to this, actually several decades ago, and it's become clearer and clearer over the last decade or decade and a half, we kind of took a new idea. We took a new approach. And what we said is that we'd like to have certainly a methodology or an approach which involves analyzing and communicating about human performance in ways that are actionable and evidence-based. Now that's comes out of the science, it comes out of the men whose names I mentioned and whose pictures I showed you a few minutes ago. That's what even comes out of those complex models. However, we'd like a version of this which uses simple visual models that are memorable and useful and can be drawn on the back of an envelope with plain language that people can remember and understand pretty quickly. Because if we can do that, we can drive understanding across organizational levels and functions. We can get anybody in the organization at one level or other, relevant to their role, participating in performance improvement. And we can build communities of shared practice with that language and those models, and we can drive collaboration and continuous improvement. So instead of having sort of performance specialists come in and do stuff, we can actually have people on the staff side and people on the management leadership side of the organization collaborating actively on things big and small that have to do with human performance. And the phrase that really emerged in our work a little more than a decade ago is performance thinking, because what our clients told us when they looked at the models and the approach that I'm about to show you is, yes, we had tools, yes, we had methodologies, but what we were basically teaching people to do is think about performance in a way that allowed them to apply these models and this logic to simple problems that you could talk about in a quick meeting with your direct report, or even like by the water cooler, or that you could apply, as some of our colleagues at larger organizations have, to multi-year complex projects and anything in between. So I want to show you the elements of what we call 6 boxes performance thinking, or performance thinking. And a way to frame those elements is with these 3 questions, because if you think about it, whether you're a leader or a manager, whether you're a training person or a OD person or an HR person, if you're trying to have an impact on performance, you really have to have answers to these 3 questions. First of all, how do we describe performance? In other words, what is human performance? And by that, I mean not just some dictionary definition or concept, but I mean looking at the performance at hand, whatever that might be, whether it's the performance of an individual or of a team or a process or a complex department. How do we describe it? What are the elements of it? And then the second question is, if we understand what performance is, what can we do to change it? In other words, what influences human performance? And by that, I don't mean, my favorite interventions. I don't mean, oh, they got a performance problem, train them, or let's do 6 Sigma because we do that around here. I mean, can we have a framework that encompasses essentially all the things we could do to improve performance in a way that we can look at them all together and be sure they all fit together? And then the third thing is, if we have answers to those first 2 questions, what can we do about it? What kind of methodology or logic or process can we follow? How do we do it, basically? So those are the 3 questions I want to show you our answers to at a very quick level, understanding that each of these things can be turned into extensive seminars, workshops, coaching sessions, and so forth. I just want to give you the sort of tips of the iceberg. First one is, what is human performance? How do we define it? So this was dramatically influenced by Tom Gilbert, whose picture I showed you earlier. Tom was a very important pioneer in the field of performance improvement, and he wrote a seminal book called Human Competence. It was published in '78, and actually we're celebrating the 40th anniversary of this year at some conferences and in some publications. But one of his big statements was, with his slightly critical eye, in the great cult of behavior, as he described it, behavior itself is viewed as an end rather than as a means to an end. In other words, if you think about it, an enormous amount of our leadership, management, training, and other kinds of activities is focused on behavior, behavioral objectives, changing behavior, changing cultural behavior, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We talk about behavior. And what I've learned is that we humans, whether we're precise about it or not so precise about it, we tend to focus on activity and behavior. But what Tom told us in the second half of this statement is, however, we must enable people to produce accomplishments, the valuable products of behavior. So what Gilbert said was, if we're going to look at performance, we need to look at what's valuable, what I sometimes call the contributions to performance. He called them accomplishments. So sort of what does that look like? Well, what that looks like is a description of performance that has essentially 3 elements. Human performance is behavior, human activity, in other words, producing accomplishments that are valuable because they contribute to business results. So these 3 elements are important. If any one of them is missing, we don't really have a good description of the kind of performance we care about. We often use metaphors and examples of this. In athletics, we can do it easily. And one of my favorites is to talk about soccer because, among other things, I can speak with our clients in Asia and Europe, and they understand it very well. But this is, in our circles, the famous soccer girl. And if this were animated, you would see she's kicking the ball. She's doing some behavior. She's actively doing something. Now, what's the point of that? Well, she's trying to produce, or have one of her teammates produce, a goal. That is, the ball in the net. And that's the accomplishment. Why is that an important accomplishment? Well, because that's how you contribute to winning the game or the score, or, if it were a professional soccer game, literally the business results. And so when we teach this to people, we want to make clear distinctions between these three things. We want to say behavior is an action, and we use verbs to describe it, what people do. Accomplishments are things, and we say they're countable nouns, and I'll talk more about that shortly. And business results, when we use that term, what we mean are the results that characterize the success for the whole organization, the whole business unit. And so, yes, there are lots of business results that are intermediate, things like cycle time and such. But what we're trying to do is connect the behavior of our employees or our people up to the success of the whole organization. So when we use the phrase business results, we mean an overall result for the organization. Now, this leads us to a model which, by the way, we've named accomplishments as work outputs. And the reason we've done that is that over the years, we've looked at people in the field of performance improvement using the word accomplishments. And very often, what they really mean is the completion of some behavior. And in fact, if you look in the dictionary, you'll see that more of the definitions for accomplishment have to do with completing behavior than they do with anything else. So we use the phrase work outputs instead. And you'll see that in our subsequent graphics, because work outputs are more easily defined as things that are the products of accomplishments. And this is one simple example of how we've refined our language to make it simple and unlikely to be misunderstood. So if you go to our first model of the two models I mentioned, we call it the performance chain. And it literally and visually describes how behavior produces business results. Now, in an organization, we care about those business results. And in fact, that's where we start. We want to know what's at stake. And if we're doing a project, we want to be sure to speak with our stakeholders and our clients about, okay, what's at stake for the whole organization? Why are we doing this? Are we trying to improve revenues or customer satisfaction or market share or quality or operational efficiency? What are the business results to which we hope this thing, whatever it is, will contribute? And if we're talking to an individual as a manager or a coach, we're trying to be sure they understand how the thing they're doing or that we're talking about is going to contribute to the whole organization too. Now, once we've got that clear, we can say, okay, what are the things that individuals, teams, processes, et cetera, produce, in other words, the work outputs, that contribute to business results? And there's a lot of different kinds of those, and that's what that list is about. There's concrete stuff like deliverables, widgets, assembled sub-assemblies, documents of various kinds, and so forth. There's also things like transactions, like sales or refunds, or other things that are basically activities that result in an outcome, and those are transactions. Decisions, that's one of my favorite work outputs, because even though they're often intangible, they may not even be written down. If you think about your own work, if you think about leaders and managers, some of the very most important work outputs are good decisions, whether they're funding decisions or hiring decisions or project change decisions or whatever they might be. Decisions are often highly valuable work outputs. And as you can see in the graphic, with these outputs, we always want to know what a good one is. We're trying to define the criteria for a good one. And that certainly applies to all of these things, including decisions. Milestones and progress indicators are what we sometimes call sub-outputs. They're things in processes after each step in a process that represent a value-added improvement or addition or component of the final output of the process. Relationships, it might seem a little odd to talk about relationships as work outputs, but if you think about your personal life or your professional life, relationships that meet certain criteria for goodness, whether, again, it's personal or professional, those are highly valuable outputs, and we work hard to establish and maintain them, and we can define them. Changes or innovations are things like new or improved processes or new ideas or product prototypes or things that are new that represent value because of their newness. Communication products, that phrase is meant to indicate the products of our communication activity. So for example, a meeting or a presentation or a sales call is not actually an output, it's an activity or behavior. We want to know what you're expecting to get at the end, a decision, a closed sale, somebody who comes up at the end and gives you their business card as a result of your presentation, whatever. So communication products and so forth. You could look at the list, but those are the valuable things, if they are, that contribute to business results. Once we define them, we can now rather rapidly and rather quickly understand, identify what behaviors needed to produce them. So we might do something like a task analysis, or we might go observe and talk to the people who produce these outputs at the highest level and capture exemplary behavior or best practices. But one way or the other, we're trying to identify the behavior that's actually needed to produce those valuable work outputs that contribute to business results. So those are the three elements of performance that I mentioned to you before. And then, of course, we have behavior influences. We have all the things that exist that either support or get in the way of behaving in the way that's needed to produce the work outputs to contribute to business results. And that's a really long list. And it depends on what books you've read and what training programs et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we will need, as you'll see, a way to make sense of those behavior influences. But this performance chain gives us a framework for understanding performance and its drivers. And what we know is, of course, in life, in work, it works from left to right. So behavior influences affect or sometimes obstruct behavior to produce work outputs that contribute to business results. We start with the end in mind. We want to be sure we understand what's at stake for the business, and then we work backwards in our analysis. So that's the first model. And it's really essential. And it's a big shift for most people because people are so accustomed to looking at behavior. We want to say, no, we want to know what the valuable products of that behavior are, because then we can tell what's important and what's not. Now, an important thing, a really important thing about this model is how work outputs connect behavior to business results. Because if you think about it in your own history or your own efforts to engage your team or whatever, there's a lot of talk sometimes about if you'll just behave this way, it'll help the business, it'll make a difference, blah, blah, blah. And while that sometimes is true, it's a little fuzzy in most cases. And so what we say is if we can define the valuable product or work output of that behavior, we can usually identify how it contributes to business results, or if not done, how it gets in the way of accomplishing business results. So this is important both sort of technically to be sure we're working on the right behavior, but also it's very important for the employee in terms of engagement, because just by having the discussion where the performer understands the thing they're producing and how it contributes to something important, like, this stupid little form that I have to fill out 100 times every day. Yeah, well, guess what? If it's complete, accurate, on time, that contributes to regulatory compliance or customer satisfaction or quality. And if it's not, it may undermine those things. With that knowledge, people sort of get their nose out of that stupid little form they're tired of and recognize the value of it. So just that connection is a start toward employee engagement. So once we know what performance is in terms of those elements, now we ask what influences it. And this is where we start out a little bit nerdy, because this little equation at the top, to be technical about it, this is Skinner's description in the laboratory of how behavior works. Discriminative stimuli set the occasion for responses which produce, hopefully, reinforcing stimuli. Now that's what it looks like in the lab. But one of those mentors that I listed, Tom Gilbert, recognized that in the real world, you have to take those three things and you have to identify the things that are in the environment, that is the data, the instruments that allow you to respond, and the incentives or consequences, and then also the things that the person brings to the table, because persons aren't laboratory animals, they're experienced humans. And so they have knowledge that they bring to the table or don't that's relevant. They have the capacity, they're analytical enough to be an accountant, they're sociable enough to be this salesperson, et cetera, et cetera. They're tall enough or strong enough to be a dock worker or whatever. So individual capacity makes a difference, as does motives, because we can present all the incentives in the world, but if we don't understand what people care about, it's going to be hard for us to be sure we have the right incentives. So this was a model that I learned in about 1980 after I read Tom's book, and then shortly thereafter I met him. And I was working down the knowledge component. I was both basically doing instructional design and development in banks and for sales organizations and so forth. And And what we realized very quickly was we could do a fantastic job with training or establishing knowledge. But if those other variables weren't in place, those other behavior influences, I now call them, in the work environment, if people didn't have the right information, if they didn't have the right environment, essentially the instruments, as Tom would describe them, if the incentives weren't there, then you wouldn't get the performance that you care about. And so we found this very powerful. But we were inherently interested in this stuff. And when we started to share this with our clients and our stakeholders, we got looks like this, like what? Like, tell me again, what are instruments? Is that like an ohm meter, or is that, what is that? You know, or what do you mean by data? Is that a spreadsheet or from a database? So we realized that Tom's concepts were great, but his words often miscommunicated. And again, in the interest of simplicity and user experience, I worked for probably 3 years with clients trying language of various kinds until I came up with this. And this is the language we settled on toward the end of the 80s. And we knew we had it because we could literally introduce this to people in 10 or 15 minutes, give them a little bit of an overview, give them some examples, and very quickly they would be able to start doing useful things with it. They weren't sophisticated performance consultants, but they didn't make so many errors. It was a lot easier to teach them. So we knew this, we had the right language. And then a few years later, one of my clients, who was a former sales VP, was looking at the model, and I was stumbling over it saying, well, this isn't exactly Tom's model anymore, but it rates, he says, well, you're always talking about those boxes. Why don't you just call it the 6 boxes? So we did, and it stuck, and we trademarked it many years later. So that's the second model. And we could spend a lot of time on this, but what I will tell you is, having been a behavior scientist originally when I was a doctoral student with Skinner, and then having been doing performance consulting and instructional work and work in companies since the early 80s, what I know is that there's nothing that affects behavior that doesn't either fit into one of those cells or relationships among them. So it's a very powerful but simple framework. Now, as is perhaps obvious, it's what we use to make sense out of the behavior influences part of this model. So that's the whole deal. And there's something like 21 words there, and they're plain English. Now, once we have that, once we know what performance is and what drives it or what influences, what do we do with that? How do we analyze and improve it? And so it turns out we just take that picture, we take that model, and we kind of unpack it. We say, okay, what's at stake here for the organization? Why are we doing this project? Or why are we having this conversation to our direct report or our team? Once we understand that in terms of business results, we say, okay, what are the outputs that are needed here? And how do they link up to those or contribute to those business results? And then we say, okay, now that we're clear on that, how much do we need to figure out about the behavior needed to produce those work outputs? Can we find the people that do it best? Do we have to do a task analysis? How do we do that? Once we've defined those 3 things, it turns out we have a powerful and flexible framework for measurement, because we can measure business results, which tend to be lagging indicators, but it's important to be measuring them. We can measure behavior, which tends to be fairly expensive and effortful to do, but we can use it to give feedback, to diagnose problems. And it turns out, highly underutilized, we can also count work outputs that meet criteria. And that's often a much quicker way to understand whether what we're doing is working or not. Once we've identified the measures, now we go to behavior influences, and we do what we call ABC. We analyze what's working in each of the cells in relationship to the desired behavior. We brainstorm possible ways of improvement or filling in gaps, and then we work with our stakeholders to choose the ones that we think will make the biggest difference in the most optimal way. Once we do that, we implement, we measure, and especially these days in sort of the lean and agile world, we iterate until we get it right. And hopefully we measure and discover what works. Now, we have listed as step 7, although it's really intermingled with all of this, that because of the simplicity of this language, we use it when we're talking to our stakeholders and interviewing people and working with our clients. And fairly quickly, this language can become viral so that we now have a shared vocabulary. And in companies like, for example, Amgen, that adopted this approach almost a decade ago, where they've got almost 200 performance consultants using it, and they've got managers and executives all over the company who share this language. And it's very powerful because it builds a shared understanding of performance. So what do? How do we help? Well, we do some pretty simple things. We basically give them the language, and we give them these 2 visual models, and people learn to be able to draw these models in the back of an envelope or a white page, a whiteboard, and describe them to each other. And then we give them some fairly simple tools and a process that follows that logic. And I'm going to show you one example of a tool. Our tools are rather simple because we don't want to box people in with tools. We want to give them a way to implement this thinking in a systematic way. What can people do with it? Well, this is a short list. Performance professionals, which includes training and development, OD, and so forth, they can do a whole bunch of stuff. They can identify the performance needed for a new employee or a job title, and they can use this approach to ramp up performance rapidly. They can look at processes and more crisply define the outputs and behavior in those processes and apply the 6 boxes to accelerate or improve the processes. They can identify the factors that define a culture, and they can strengthen culture, it turns out, with this. We're kind of excited about that. I just published something in Journal of Organizational Behavior Management about a year and a half ago about a kind of a cutting edge approach that this brings to culture change. They can build this into their talent development process. I'm going to show you a little bit of a process map shortly that sort of gives you a glimmer of how that would work. And they can also do a new form of executive coaching, which focuses on the performance of the executive and his or her contributions and the performance of their teams and the processes that they manage. Managers or coaches working with individuals or teams can continuously develop their individual and team performance. And so our coaching and management programs are all about that. They're about enabling managers to either quickly and flexibly, or in a little bit more formal way, define important outputs they want to develop or add to people's capabilities, go through the conversation about behavior and criteria, and then come up with agreed upon steps with those employees to improve stuff. They can also they can be the on-the-ground part of managing performance to organizational culture or values. And we could talk about that more if you were interested at a later time. And they also can use, as you'll see shortly, this framework to optimize employee engagement, which we think is a huge application. Because it turns out if you do it right, the same variables that optimize performance also optimize employee engagement. And finally, as you move up in the organization as a leader, you can apply this to strategy execution. You can work with your team of managers to implement employee engagement plans across the whole department or business unit. You can manage change and implement new things. You can really manage your managers to engage them in a continuous development process with their people. And if you're at the very top of an organization, you can use this framework as a way to understand how the vision and mission and expectations and priorities that you're communicating to your business unit or organization can be executed and implemented through more effective arrangement of the 6 boxes. And this is just a short list, but you get the idea. We have this core set of models language that now can be used by literally anybody. And I haven't listed individuals who can use this to develop their own performance. This graphic is a slightly unusual one, but it makes a point that we try to engage when we begin to work with leaders and managers. And that is that if you go through the exercise of figuring out what leaders and managers do, it turns out that if you just do sort of a flip chart with a group brainstorm, much or most of what leaders or managers do is arrange conditions that can sort into the 6 boxes to optimize the performance of their team members. And so if as a leader or manager, you understand your job in that way, and you have these tools, it gives you tremendous leverage to do what we said in the beginning, which is to accelerate organizational or business results through your people. Now, the topic of employee engagement is a big one in many companies, and companies have lots of approaches to it. But the Gallup organization has been using a particular survey in organizations for a long time. And they've published research in Harvard Business Review and elsewhere about the results of this. And it turns out that companies who score highly on their employee engagement survey also have measurably better market share, customer satisfaction, revenues, and so forth. So there's direct bottom line impact of employee engagement. Now, it's interesting, and we've been sort of saying something like this for years, but it's only been about 8 years ago that we recognized this. This are the 12 items from the Gallup survey that's so highly correlated with bottom line results. And the way the survey works is the employees rate from sort of not at all to a whole bunch, on a I think a 5-point scale, the extent to which these statements are true for them. And so the ones in organizations where there's a lot more true than not, it turns out, as I say, they have big bottom line impact. Well, guess what? These sort with remarkable simplicity into the 6 boxes model. And what that starts to make you recognize is that the very influences that affect performance, if they're coordinated with one another, if it's viewed as a whole system, and if we optimize them in a positive way, we produce both high levels of performance or discretionary effort and employee engagement. And in fact, we can expand on this with the 6 boxes to define some management best practices. And when we work with managers and leaders, we talk about these in detail. And in fact, you can even build a curriculum for specific management leadership skills around this framework. One of the tools, and I mentioned I was going to mention a tool that we use to help both performance consultants and individual managers and leaders define the outputs of their people, is what we call a customer diagram. And so if you look at this picture, Mary Hansen, in this case, this is something created by Mary and her manager, and she's an HR professional, and she delivers value to those departments listed at the top, to the VP of retail. She produces some things for herself that make a big difference, that are valuable, for her human resources colleagues, and for senior HR business partners. Once we define the customers of her value add, we then, as you can see, can list the work outputs. Now, what's remarkable about this is if we listed her behavior, it would go on page after page. But if we list the major work outputs or accomplishments of a job, it turns out to be a finite list. And over the last few years, some of our clients, like, for example, Insperity and Easter Seals Bay Area and Alpha Time Group in Dubai, have been starting to build accomplishments or work outputs into their job descriptions instead of or in addition to competencies, which tend to be problematic in many ways because of their level of abstraction. So if you can define somebody's job, and especially if you have a conversation with them as their manager or supervisor in terms of these outputs, you can then say, okay, what's most important, Mary? What do we want to add to this? Or which things can we strengthen? Or what's most important for us now? Let's apply the 6 boxes to come up with some suggestions for how to improve these things. And so that's a whole thing that we teach in our management coaching programs. But consider if that's at the core of your understanding of performance. It turns out, as some of our organizations are doing, you can build an entire talent development or performance management system around that. You can recruit people with behavioral interviewing questions that focus on major accomplishments or work outputs of a job. You can onboard them by bringing them up to speed on core accomplishments they need to be able to produce. You can train them for their jobs in more advanced ways by focusing on the outputs that they need to produce. You can then put them into a cycle, which if your managers or supervisors know how to use 6 boxes performance coaching, or if they've gone through the performance thinking manager, they can use this to have a performance development meeting, to define outputs to work on, to select one to come up with a plan about, to then do touch points, coaching sessions on some regular basis, and continue that cycle to continuously develop and improve the performance of their people. And at the end of the year, quarterly, you can identify people who are ready for transfers or new jobs or higher levels of salary. You can do your comp reviews built on this. So unlike competencies, which are rather fuzzy in many respects, that typically are rated on subjective scales, you can define work outputs rather objectively, and you can identify what's most important, and you can build a talent development whole thing around that. Now, most of our clients are not anywhere near this yet, but this is the cutting edge. This is what's starting to happen in some of our client organizations. Not necessary, but it's a very interesting possibility. So with all that in mind, there's one other thing I want to add, which is that we practice what we preach. We don't think you can just run people through our programs and have it all work out. What we do is we apply the very same approach to planning to build organizational culture, planning to build communities of practice. So this slide shows the first page on our implementation planning tools, that if you were to adopt one of our programs, we want to sit down with key decision makers and go through these to identify and have discussions about the behavior influences in the environment of the people who would be going through the program to support the actual application and continued development of applying this on their jobs in the organization. In fact, again, our longest client is Amgen, who's been doing this for almost a decade. I talked to the leaders there, and they're still refining their global community of practice using this framework to enable their performance consultants to be more and more effective, more and more productive, to enable their managers and stakeholders and leaders to collaborate in more and more effective ways. So we practice what we preach when it comes to implementing our programs as well. So that's a lot, and I appreciate your having spent time listening to this if you've made it to the end. We have at sixboxes.com probably a lot more information than you want to know about, but you can learn more details about our programs. And we have a section called the Resource Library that has a whole lot of downloadable white papers and publications that you don't have to give us your email for, although we would certainly appreciate it so we can keep in touch. But there's a lot more about this. I hope in this relatively brief overview, I've given you enough to pique your interest and possibly lead to further discussion. So thank you very much for your time.